Palpatine, or Sheev if you're on a first-name basis with the galaxy's biggest war criminal, is most well known as the Emperor, the Chancellor of the Republic, or the Sith Lord Darth Sidious. But he's also really well known for being the manipulative mastermind behind basically every atrocity in Star Wars. So let's take a look through the war crimes he's committed and figure out how high of a sentence he'd get if the Republic, or better yet the Hague, ever managed to put the Senate's favorite Sith Lord on trial. We're going to go through things in chronological order, which means we start with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. The first war crime comes in the form of the Naboo crisis. Palpatine's alter ego Darth Sidious manipulated the Trade Federation, and specifically its Viceroy Newt Gunray, into blockading his own peaceful planet so he can manipulate the Senate and ultimately rise from being the Senator of Naboo into the Chancellor of the Republic. He approves not only the blockade, but also an invasion of the planet to not only take control, but also force Queen Amidala to sign a treaty to make the blockade and invasion legal. This would have allowed Senator Palpatine to step in, point to the incident, and convince the Senate that the current Chancellor was doing nothing to help, have him outed, and put himself forward for the job. But in reality, that's not just political scheming, that's what modern law calls a crime of aggression. Starting an illegal war just so you can get a promotion and work your way up the political ladder? Yeah, that's like invading Poland so you can snag Employee of the Month. For this stunt alone, Palpatine is looking at about 20 years in prison, and that's before he even becomes Chancellor. Now let's talk about his real magnum opus, the Clone Wars. This man somehow literally engineered a galaxy-wide war turning the Separatists against the Republic, and he puppeteered both sides. That's the equivalent of the US president being the secret CEO of some terrorist organization just to keep the war machine going. As a result, millions of clones died, countless numbers of civilians were caught in the crossfire, races destroyed, entire planets burned, and lives in nearly every major sector of the galaxy ruined. He worked behind the scenes, manipulating senators from planets far and wide to coerce them into continuing the war, funding it, and spreading chaos and misery that helped him cloak his true intentions of getting the galaxy into a position where he could finally enact his devious plan to wipe out the Jedi Order. But we'll get to that particular war crime soon. Starting the Clone Wars, well, in our world that's some kind of war crime buffet that includes conspiracy to wage war, crimes against humanity, and mass civilian casualties. So when it comes to his sentence, Palpatine would unquestionably be looking at life. Multiple lives, actually. And then let's tack on 100 years just to make the math extra spicy. And while we're on the subject of the Clone Wars, and more specifically the clones themselves, let's talk about his little science project. Palpatine commissions the Kaminoans to create an army of genetically modified soldiers. Their growth was sped up, meaning that they grew up far faster than they would naturally. Yeah, the clones might look like adults, but they're only like 13 in actual real-world terms, thanks to that growth tweak, and no matter where you're from, 13-year-old soldiers is a big no-no. Add in the inhibitor chips, something that basically controls their thoughts and mind, and what do we have? Child soldiers, involuntary slavery, and involuntary human experimentation. That's straight-up Nuremberg trials material. In real law, that's easily another 500 years behind bars. But Palpatine doesn't stop at those kinds of war crimes. Oh no, he's got to go for the political crimes too. When he stands up and declares, "I am the Senate," it's more than just a hilarious meme, that's the exact moment he dismantles democracy. He used the war to seize emergency powers, then never gave them back, eventually naming himself the Supreme Chancellor. In real life, that's called a coup. And for that, he's looking at another 25 years minimum. Probably more, considering the size of the power grab he's making. Heading back into those more overt and violent war crimes, and Palpatine was out there ordering assassinations and torturing dissidents. For an example, look at what happened to Clone Trooper 5s. He discovered the truth about the inhibitor chip and uncovered that every clone in the army had one planted in them at birth. He wanted to expose the truth and save his brothers, but when Palpatine found out, he made it his mission to ensure that 5s did not tell anyone else he was discovered. The rogue clone went on the run, but soon wound up dead, keeping Palpatine's secret safe until the opportune moment to uncover it. Palpatine treats these kinds of war crimes like side quests. Torture, unlawful killings, and targeted assassinations are a Geneva Convention's violation starter pack. And for that, Palpatine's gonna find at least another 30 years per instance added to his sentence. And then we get to the big one. Order 66. If the Clone Wars was Palpatine's cake, Order 66 was the cherry on top. The Sith Lord frames the Jedi as traitors and orders their mass extermination via the inhibitor chips in the clones. Across the galaxy, Republic troopers wipe out their generals, and Palpatine personally oversees the mass murder of an entire religious order. Knights, masters, Padawans, and younglings included. In modern terms, that's genocide, crimes against humanity, and extermination of a protected group. Sentence? Multiple life terms without parole. Courts aren't going to play around with this one. They'll lock you up and throw away the key into a black hole. Palpatine's intent was clear and unfounded. But wait, he's not done. In fact, he's just getting into his stride. On Mustafar, Palpatine sends Anakin to deal with the Separatist Council. And by deal with, I mean execute without trial. They were loose ends that he had no further use for, and so he wanted to get rid of them. While the Separatist leadership were all evil and guilty in their own way, they weren't combatants. They were unarmed politicians, essentially trapped on Mustafar. That's extrajudicial execution of political prisoners, another unforgivable act. Toss another 50 years onto his pile. And then, of course, as Emperor, Palpatine really leans into the evil. Oppression of any and all alien species, forced labor for the Death Star, and, oh yeah, blowing up Alderaan. Planetary genocide. That's not just a war crime, that's a war crime on steroids. For that, honestly, you don't even get a sentence, you just get the electric chair. Which is ironic, really, given his whole Sith lightning vibe. While the Naboo blockade, Clone Wars, Order 66, and Alderaan are the headline acts in Palpatine's galactic rap sheet, his portfolio of war crimes stretches much farther than that. The Emperor didn't just commit grand and open atrocities, he institutionalized them, making systemic cruelty something that was okay within the Galactic Empire. Let's dig into some of his bonus round crimes that would have had the Hague working overtime. First, let's talk forced labor on an industrial scale. The Death Star wasn't built by volunteers with great dental plans, it was constructed by enslaved Geonosians, as well as humans, Wookiees, Mon Calamari, Twi'leks, and countless others ripped from their homes. Enslavement is outlawed under basically every legal system worth anything, but Palpatine not only condoned it, he made it galactic policy. Entire populations were reduced to disposable workers in mines, factories, shipyards, and even prisons, where the chances of survival weren't measured in years, they were measured in months or even weeks. That's slavery, torture, and mass killing all rolled into one. And for that, Palpatine would be slapped with 5 life sentences, plus an additional 500 years. Then there's his campaign of species-based persecution. Palpatine's new order was deeply xenophobic. Non-humans were excluded from power, economically strangled, and politically repressed. Palpatine put up with them during his time as chancellor, but as emperor, he had absolute power. Whole species were scapegoated, stripped of rights, or outright exterminated. The Lasat were nearly wiped out. Geonosians were sterilized to extinction after helping construct the first Death Star, and Wookiees were enslaved en masse after Kashyyyk fell. This wasn't just bad policy, it was ethnic cleansing. In modern terms, that's genocide and apartheid. Crimes recognized as among the gravest in international law. Again, 10 stacked life sentences plus 500 years. Moving from wide-scale oppression to specific massacres, Palpatine routinely used planetary destruction as a teachable moment. Alderaan is the famous example, but it wasn't the only one. The bombardment of Mon Cala after its resistance movement gained traction. The annihilation of Gorman's peacefully protesting civilians, and the depopulation of Lasan by the Empire's pacification forces all had his fingerprints covering them. These acts weren't military necessity, they were demonstrations of power. Deliberate terror campaigns designed to break spirits and cement control. That's 50 years per massacre. So let's be conservative and say 250 to 300 years for those crimes. And speaking of terror, Palpatine weaponized fear like no one else. Under his rule, torture became standard operating procedure. The Imperial Security Bureau and Imperial Intelligence ran prisons, labor camps, and detention centers across the galaxy, places where dissidents disappeared and never came back. In modern parallels, that's enforced disappearance and systematic torture, both war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence is another life term plus 200 years. Even Palpatine's dabbling in Sith sorcery could count as crimes in a legal sense. Consider Exegol, where he bred legions of fanatical cultists and experimented with cloning and unnatural life extension. These weren't just creepy hobbies, they were programs involving involuntary experimentation, biological tampering, and militarized bioengineering. Creepy and weird stuff, right? In any war crimes tribunal, this would fall under prohibited biological experimentation and abuse of science for warfare. So that's another life sentence plus 100 years. And finally, the biggest meta crime of them all, waging a permanent state of war. Palpatine never intended peace. His governance thrived on constant militarization, invasion, and suppression. It's how he ran his empire. By maintaining a galactic system where war was the consistent baseline, he ensured that atrocities weren't out of the ordinary, but instead the daily norm. Here's the thing, Palpatine's hands are relatively clean. While he positioned all of the pieces on his grand galactic-sized chessboard, and he ordered the atrocities to happen, he very rarely got his hands dirty himself. He might try to use this as a defense, but in truth, while he wasn't the one to personally kill every Jedi in the Order or press the fire button on the Death Star, his fingerprints were still all over everything that he oversaw. Palpatine is clearly guilty, so let's stack it all up. The Naboo blockade is gonna net him 20 years, the Clone Wars conspiracy is life plus 100 years, clones as child soldiers is 100 years, his expert dismantling of democracy gets him 25 years, general torture and assassinations adds 30 years, Order 66 is easily multiple life sentences, the Order of the Separatist Council massacre gets 50 years, forced labor is 500 years, galactic massacres add 300 years, weaponized terror is another 200 years, the Sith sorcery is life plus 100 years, and what happened to Alderaan and his overall galactic tyranny, well, you can't even put a number on it. Grand total? We're looking at well over 2,000 years in prison, multiple life sentences, maybe even inventing a new punishment where they resurrect him just so they can re-sentence him again. But here's the kicker, none of this ever happens. Instead of facing justice, Palpatine dies screaming while throwing lightning everywhere, and somehow comes back in Episode 9 to pick up exactly where he left off, and keep racking up those war crimes like he's speed-running atrocities. Honestly, Darth Sidious isn't just a Sith Lord, he's the undisputed MVP of galactic war crimes. If Anakin racked him up like PlayStation trophies, Palpatine's got the whole Platinum collection already.